This is Mark Varian. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Research Institute at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and I'm the moderator for the webinar this afternoon, Worlds Forever Changed, the Vázquez de Coronado Expedition to Central New Mexico, 1540 to 1542. I want to thank people for making this possible. Taylor has really taken over this webinar series and is responsible for all the logistics, and she just does an incredible job. Funding has been also provided by the Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as a part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act Economic Stabilization Plan for 2020. Just a few logistics about how the talk works for you. You may see the talking heads of the people who are speaking, and you can minimize that, and you can also grab it with your cursor and move it up to the corner of your screen so it doesn't block the images that the speakers will be showing. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the Zoom menu, I believe, and we'll try to get to all your questions, and if we don't get to them tonight, because there's too many, we'll try and follow up with you and answer your questions. If you're having any problems with the Zoom feed, you can also stream this talk at that link on Crow Canyon's Facebook page. So if you just went to Facebook and found Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, this talk would be there right now. We also record all of these webinars and put them on Crow Canyon's YouTube site, and you see the link there. So if you have to miss part of this one, or you want to go back and listen to parts of it over, you can get it on the YouTube. And I'd really encourage you to go to the YouTube site and look for others that we've done already that you may have missed. They've really uniformly been fantastic, and I think you'd enjoy listening to earlier webinars too. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center is a not-for-profit located outside of Cortez, Colorado. For those of you that don't know, the center was founded in 1983, although it has a history that goes longer than that as the Crow Canyon School. Our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. Check out our website, please, at crowcanyon.org. We have a couple more webinars coming up in the next 2 weeks. Exploring Social Environments in the Southeast and Southwest with Dr. Catherine Cameron, who just retired from a professor's job at the University of Colorado Boulder. The next week, Crow Canyon's own Rebecca Hammond, a Ute Mountain Ute Nation member, will be presenting a presentation on Ute history, and I've seen that program, and it's really, really good, and Rebecca is an extremely good presenter. We have a lot of questions about how Native nations can be helped during the COVID crisis, and this is a series of links to places that you can go to find out what's needed and provide assistance. So look at them now and jot them down, or if you don't have a pencil handy or enough time, you can go to the YouTube site, and this slide will be there, and you can get it from that slide. All right, I'm really grateful to Matt and John for being the scholars that are making the presentation tonight. Dr. Matt Schmader has been conducting archaeological research for 40 years in the southwestern United States and obtained his PhD in 1994 from the University of New Mexico. He's worked on a wide variety of sites in central New Mexico, from Paleo-Indian campsites and archaic period dwellings to pit house villages, sacred petroglyph sites, and historic red light district in downtown Albuquerque. Since 2007, his research is focused on the 1540 to 1542 Coronado exploration in the Rio Grande Valley, its conflicts and impacts on local native populations. He's the former Albuquerque city archaeologist and is currently an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico Department of Anthropology. John Ghahate and I said that wrong, I apologize, John, is from the Pueblos of Laguna and Zuni and of the Turkey and Badger clans. He currently serves as the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center Museum Cultural Educator in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His responsibilities are to develop and present an authentic and respectful historical narrative of the culture, heritage, and legacy of New Mexico's Pueblo communities. His diverse professional background includes being a healthcare practitioner, a public middle school and high school math and science educator, an athletic coach for the public school system, a journalist for a national radio talk program, and a community volunteer for a variety of community conscious organizations. He's a Vietnam veteran. John has received a number of community, military service related, and professional commendations. He was a fellow of the Kellogg National Leadership Foundation program. He is a lifelong resident of New Mexico and his tribal nations, and a parent and proud father of 2 children. Take it away, guys.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering why
Try
it's
that
not going
icon
to
at the
slideshow.
bottom. Try that icon at the bottom next to the slide bar. Over one, two more.
Just share, Matt.
Where is it?
Right there, Matt.
That one? Oh, there.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Crow Canyon Archaeological Center for this invitation, and especially to Mark and to Taylor for having set this up. But in particular, I'm very honored to be presenting today with John. It's going to be a real privilege. What I want to do today is to present some current research on the famous but not very well understood expedition of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado into the American Southwest. And in so doing, I want to give some background, particularly be sure to incorporate some Puebloan viewpoints on these events, and to try and match physical evidence with documents that were created at the time, to interpret that physical evidence, and to give a historical perspective on the far-reaching effects of the Coronado expedition from both a Pueblo and archaeological standpoint. And along the way, I'm hoping that I can try to dispel and address a lot of the most common misconceptions about this expedition. So, like all great stories, this one has to have a great backstory. And in so doing, we're going to take the Wayback Machine. We're going to go back to 1492 with the very first voyage by Christopher Columbus. I like to call him Cristobal Colon. But the thinking at that point in time was that if you sailed west from Europe, eventually you would hit islands, and those islands would be the gateway to Asia. So Colon had sold the idea of his exploration to Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the king and queen of Spain in 1492. They contracted him to do the exploration, and when he sailed west, he did in fact hit islands. The problem was they were not small islands that were the gateway to Asia. They were huge islands that were the size of the North and South American continents. So Colon actually died thinking that he had found the gateway to Asia. This particular graphic here is a map made by Sebastian Münster in 1526, begins to show the outline of what Europeans ethnocentrically called Novus Orbis, the New World. I like to refer to the Western Hemisphere as the fourth part of the world. That is, at that time, Asia, Africa, and Europe were known as the three parts of the world, and the fourth part of the world was the Western Hemisphere. But it wasn't really a new world at all. And I'm wondering if John would like to comment on that concept of not calling this a new world.
Well, what I would like to say, Matt, just some talking points as we continue with this discussion is some take-home things that I think we should keep in mind when we think about history, especially as it applies to the Western Hemisphere, is that prior to 1492, and we can look at the most recent scientific announcements that have come through, that scientists have decided to roll back their previous understanding of how long humans have occupied the Western Hemisphere. And most recently, it has been up to another additional 15,000 years that scientists accept the fact that humans began to populate the Western Hemisphere. So by the 14th century, humans were already on this side of the world. They had established civilizations, they had established commerce, they had established philosophy, science, and math. Without those constructs, these civilizations would not have been able to be long-standing, permanent, and majority of them agrarian societies. In addition to that, they had developed spiritual constructs. They had developed, majority of them were matrilineal societies, where women and the mothers were the central part of their communities. And so this is, at least 500 years before the Europeans even came to this Western side. And oftentimes we are taught that, or in school we're told that Columbus thought the world was flat. Most people who were academics at the time already knew at least 400 to 500 years before that they accepted that the world was at least a globe or round. And so there were a lot of things that we are taught that aren't always used as part of our general understanding. So that's what I'd like to help explain, that these civilizations they had governments and they had social structures that allowed them to exist for at least 400 to 500 years before the Europeans even came. And so for some of those communities prior to 1492, they had established these spiritual constructs that perhaps contributed to why the Spanish saw them as perhaps worthy of the Christian faith. And there are those that they didn't see as worthy of the Christian faith. And so as a result of that, they then simply saw them as commodities. They saw them as fodder, slave material, or even simply something to get rid of. But certainly the kingdoms of Aragon and Granada and Castile, being very religious and devout Catholics, they then felt it was their responsibility to spread the Catholic faith. And so with that responsibility, that's why they certainly sought to Christianize many of these indigenous communities. Without that construct, without having that idea, we would not still be here. Those of us, those indigenous peoples that are still here today in the year 2020, that perhaps that was one of the benefits or the positives of the Christians seeing us as having a soul, having a spirit, and then certainly worthy of the Catholic faith. That's what we kind of have to think about when it comes to Europeans coming to this side of the world, that they saw them in that regard.
Well, that was excellent, John, and it reminds us of some of the mythology that the world was thought of as being flat. It was known as round, and the problem is we just didn't know how large it was. And the Europeans were completely unprepared for meeting new races of people, because they thought, again, that they were going to encounter Asians. And so the entire centuries-long encounter with native populations in the fourth part of the world really threw them off. If you look here in the middle of this monster map, you see Cuba. And by 1515, the Spanish had already set up a colonial administration in Cuba. They started to explore the eastern coastline of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. And by 1517, we're planning expeditions to find out what was on the what turned out to be the Mexican mainland. In 1519, Hernan Cortez commandeered a few ships and sailed off to the west, to the Gulf of Mexico and to the Yucatan coast, and began what ended up being a brutal and very bloody, hard-fought conquest of the Aztec Empire in the Valley of Mexico, the center of Mexico, by, for one thing, making a lot of allies with the enemies of the Aztecs, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Cortez, by 1521, has conquered the Aztec Empire. This is a map of the fourth part of the world by Abraham Ortelius in 1576, and you can see by this time Mexico is already on the map. There are some other places that are eventually going to get explored, but the main thing that you can get from this map is you see there's a very vast unknown area to the north and northwest of what is called New Spain, that is Mexico. And if the thinking was, the conventional wisdom was, if you go to the north and northwest from New Spain, this was going to be the doorstep to Asia. This is how you're going to get to India, how you're going to get to China, and this was very important to the Spanish at the time because they were in a race with Portugal to try to get the best route for all kinds of riches, especially for spices. So this big blank part of the map here was the goal for the next explorations after Cortez had vanquished the Aztecs and after Pizarro had gone down to Peru and vanquished the Inca. Both of those, the Aztec and the Inca, yielded great amounts of riches and gold. But the main thing was there had to be another civilization that had as yet been unfound, and that would be up here to the north and northwest. So that was the impetus for going up there. It was not to find the 7 cities of gold, which is another one of the myths about the Coronado expedition. Now, already by 1535, it's amazing to think, but 15 years after Cortez had conquered the Aztec Empire, the Spanish already had a colonial administration set up in central Mexico. It was under the guidance, auspices of Antonio de Mendoza, who was the first viceroy of New Spain. This word viceroy basically means under king. And this colonial administration, based out of the Valley of Mexico, administered by Mendoza, the under king, was accountable to none other than King Carlos I of Spain, who also happened to be known as Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And so at that point in time, in the 1530s, this Holy Roman Emperor was the most powerful person in at least the European world, and he had all of the power and influence, including that of the Pope, of almost anybody who you can imagine. So when Mendoza and when Coronado himself are writing letters to King Carlos I, the Holy Roman Emperor, they are writing letters to the most powerful man on the planet at that time. Well, that wisdom or knowledge, I should say, that you should go north and northwest to find the gateway to India and to China, translated into an early exploratory exploration led by a priest named Fray Marcos de Niza, who left from the west coast of Mexico and traveled north, following rumors that there were settled lands and great civilizations in an area called Cibola. Some of this information came from, and he was helped guided by some of the survivors of another fantastic story of survival. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca and 3 other survivors who survived shipwreck off of Florida, walked all the way across Texas, and made their way to western Mexico, reporting that there were settled lands to the north. One of their survivors was a black man, at least of Moorish descent, named Esteban. And Esteban was enlisted to be the guide for Marcos de Niza to take de Niza up and see where these settled lands were. So Esteban was the guide to Niza, and he ends up guiding them up towards Cibola. I think John had some other observations about the role of Esteban.
Well, let me just add this, and also this might, I see down at the bottom someone's question about why is the myth of the 7 cities of gold so prevalent. One of the reasons why, as Matt said, is that's what we are often told, but at the time the Spanish were so adamant that they were so close to getting to Asia. It was not China at the time, but there was other names that they had used for that area, but it was Asia that they wanted. Those were the areas where the spices and the silk and other riches were there. That's why they were so adamant in getting there. They wanted to cut out the middleman. But the story behind Esteban or Estebanico, or is actually he was a Moor. He was from Morocco. He was captured by the Portuguese in 1525, sold to a Spanish nobleman. Then he and the Spanish nobleman sailed to Hispaniola in 1526. Then they started out on this journey in 1528. They got caught in a hurricane and somehow got washed ashore on the western side of Florida. Some people say near Tampa Bay, present-day Tampa Bay. And over the next 8 years, they were basically trying to get back to New Spain at the time. And through that period of time, this individual, Estebanico or Esteban, was perhaps a very sly, perhaps maybe a snake oilsman type of person. He just basically took it upon himself because, think of this, he was a slave. He was a nobody. He was an unperson. But to lead Spaniards would be so not even thought of at the time. A slave leading these Spanish noblemen trying to survive through these 8 years, eventually coming back to Spain in 1536. And at this time, then Viceroy Mendoza is the Viceroy. And perhaps through it all, some of those indigenous peoples that were in Louisiana and northern Texas probably just wanted to get them out of here by saying, you know what, if you just keep going north, you're going to get to this place with all these riches. You'll find these cities of gold. And maybe that's why that myth stood up for them, because they were still enamored and very much enthralled with still finding all these riches, and so prevalent in our history. But it really was, as it turns out, a lie. As Matt will tell you, the impact that Fray Marcos de Niza had to finally endure once he led Coronado up onto the northern part of Cibola.
Okay. Well, what ends up happening? Esteban is ahead of de Niza, makes his way to Cibola. Well, Cibola is now where Zuni Pueblo is in New Mexico. And he ends up committing some cultural offenses, and he gets killed. When de Niza comes to find him and finds out that Esteban has been killed, he views Zuni Pueblo from afar and says, well, I have seen settlements here, and that must be what we're looking for. So Deniza rushes back to report to Mendoza that he should go ahead and continue the big expedition that they had been planning. I have a colleague from Harvard, and he likes to say that from the Zuni point of view, the first white man that the Zunis ever saw was a black man. Well,
exactly. And then
Mendoza
someone made a little
decides
question here.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to mention
What's
that
that?
someone had a question here that said, was Esteban a Jew? No one really knows. But we can speculate that he was probably more associated to Islam, because Islam had been progressing westward along the western coast of Africa. But we don't know whether he was or wasn't. But it's probably unlikely that he was not a Jew. But we don't know for sure.
Right.
He did have an Arabic name, though.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if anything, he was. If we had to figure out a religion, he's most likely a Muslim. Well, Mendoza has to select a leader for this coming expedition who he trusts, and he chooses a friend of the family, his governor of a province, a new province in New Spain called Nueva Galicia. And the governor is Francisco Vázquez de Coronado y Anaya, or Vázquez de Coronado, who was 29 years old at the time. He had almost no military experience, so he was really an administrator more than anything, but he was highly trusted by Mendoza. Now, this is another image of Coronado, and I think you can tell that we don't know what Coronado looked like at all. But this image I like to show because it does talk about one of the other myths, and that is these explorers, who sometimes are called conquistadores, whether or not they conquered anything, were always dressed up in suits of iron, shiny helmets, and this very noble and regal look. In all likelihood, nobody involved was wearing shiny coats of armor on this expedition. Now, this is a very text-dense slide. I'll go through it very quickly, but the reason I like to do this is I'll sometimes say, what is the big deal about the Vázquez de Coronado expedition? And the answer is, it was a very big deal. It was probably the largest land-based expedition ever organized under the auspices of the Spanish crown, at least in the 16th century. They were on the road for 2 1/3 years, from February of 1540 until the summer of 1542. They went 4,600 miles, which is the same as walking from Cortez to Boston, or maybe more accurately from Puerto Vallarta to Wichita and back. There were a lot of people wanted to enlist, and so by the time they enlisted, there were 360 European men. It's stretching it to call them soldiers because only about 10% of them had any military experience at all. Most of them were tradesmen, accountants, lawyers, and people like that. But it was not an army. So that's another one of the myths that we have to try and make sure that we dispel. And for those 360 Europeans, they had 29 crossbows, 35 arquebuses, which are primitive muskets, and 83 swords. So you can see almost all of the Europeans, 90% of them, had other weapons, and these weapons are what are called armas de la tierra, arms of the field. So they're sharpened sticks, wooden clubs, leather shields, things like that. But this was not a highly equipped, highly organized army. It was a loose association of people who didn't have a lot of military experience because they were going to set up diplomatic relations. This is a very important, remember this if you don't remember anything else I say. There were 1,200 to 2,000 or more Indios Amigos or Aliados, and the Indios Amigos were from a wide variety of indigenous cultures in Mexico and listed as Mexican indigenous soldiers to help support this expedition. Many of them were themselves in some form of slavery. Some of them were motivated to go to gain exploits and fame in war, which was a way that you could get more power. Some of them were probably trying to find slaves of their own. And many of them were in some form of servitude, but at least 2,000, because some of the estimates are much higher than that, but probably 2,000 Indios Amigos were on this. So this is an expedition of probably 2,500 or so, and only 1/4 of them were Europeans. And for every person, there was also an unnamed person, a porter, a carrier, and the many, many women who were involved who were never mentioned. You can imagine trying to feed several thousand people every day. It required thousands of tortillas and many tons of food every single day. All that work was done by women. So if it wasn't for the women and the Indios Amigos, this whole expedition would not have succeeded. There were also the Pueblo people, in particular American Southwest and all along the way, had never seen horses before, and there were over 1,100 horses, 5,000 to 10,000 head of livestock at various times to try and feed all of these people. And as was the practice in the 16th century, any expedition that was licensed by the king, that is by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, he was not going to pay for anything. It was all entirely privately funded, and every soldier who participated, what they brought was strictly accounted for, because once they struck it rich, then all of their everything that they got was going to be apportioned to whatever was contributed. That 600,000 silver pesos is equivalent to 19 tons of silver, which is worth about $20 to $25 million today, not adjusted for inflation. So the whole cost of this expedition probably ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars in today's currency. And this is just a quick reminder of the Europeans. There were at least 8 nationalities involved: Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Italy, England, Scotland, Corsica, Greece, and Crete. From North Africa, there were Moors and maybe others, even sub-Saharan. And the Mexican, the Indian, Indios Amigos were from a wide variety, but they were Mexica, Tarascans, Tlaxcalans, Tlaltecans, Tenochtians, Otomi, Caxcanes, Chichimecas, Opatas, and Zapotecas. So all from the Central Valley of Mexico and the western coast of Mexico. Some of these were former enemies of each other, loosely affiliated into various groups in the expedition. So this is exactly what the expedition looked like, of course, right? This is a painting, 1906 painting by Frederick Remington, and it shows some of the mythology I'm talking about. You've got all of the European soldiers are wearing metal helmets. They're all very well equipped. They're all in very good order. And this is not the way they looked, and it's not the way they proceeded, because they were actually hopping forward and back in various advanced parties and a lot of parties that were lagging behind. But that's part of the mythology that has gone along with this expedition. The expedition leaves in February of 1540 from Compostela, which is just near Puerto Vallarta, and follows along the west coast. They pick up more people in Culiacan, and they start to go back up to where Deniza had said Cibola was. Well, they follow along the coast, and eventually they have to depart and head straight north, although the wisdom of the time dictated that the coast of Mexico went around and curved back to the northeast, so that they had supply ships that came all the way up, and the supply ships were going to supply the expedition when it reached Cibola. Of course, the supply ships run into the mouth of the Colorado River, and they sail up as far as Yuma, Arizona, before they're forced to turn back. When the expedition reaches Cibola, which is now Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, the Chihuahua, the Zuni, believe that Coronado is coming to avenge the death of Esteban. And of course, Coronado thinks he's about to find these great civilizations that are the doorway to Asia. So both sides are completely off. And what happens when that happens? You end up with a battle. The very first battle between Europeans and indigenous people of the American Southwest happens at Zuni Pueblo on July the 7th, 1540. One of the things that happens, too, for bad timing, this entire expedition ends up crossing the Sonoran Desert in June, crossing the border wall area in June. And so by that time, they're hot, tired, starving, and they need food. And of course, the only place they can get any kind of food and recover from this long, arduous journey that's already happened is to fight with and try to overcome the Zunis. I don't know, John, here I think you may have some comments about the usage of the term Pueblo and some of the events that might have happened.
So let me just add a couple of things here, Matt. Number one, the word Cibola is really a Spanish word that references what other groups would call the buffalo. And that's where they thought the buffalo lived. But really, the word we use in our language for where my father comes from, the village at the time that was the main village, and there were several villages, at least we know of 7 at the time the Spanish came in the 1500s, was Hawiku. Hawiku is the original home village of who we are. And so that's the myth, again, of the fact that this place was called Cibola, but that was really a Spanish interpretation. And then one thing I'd also like to add to that is the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, we call them pueblos now, but even that word is from the Spanish as well. They simply saw them as communities, and in Latin and then in Spanish, the word pueblo applies to the physical village or the community. But at some point, the Spanish simply began to see them, well, you're from this pueblo or you're from this pueblo, and they began to transfer that name to the individual. So now you're a pueblo or you're a pueblo as compared to those other individuals that didn't live in that same kind of environment. Our neighbors, the Navajo, the Apaches, the Utes, the Paiutes, the Chimecas, all of those individuals that the Spanish didn't see them in that same regard. So they're non-pueblos, whereas that's where we get that word. So pueblo really is a Spanish term. And who we are in my father's side, we say who we are as people, we say we're Ashu. That's the name we give to ourselves in our language. So the word pueblo is really a Spanish word in that regard. And someone asked a question a little bit ago about was there any story or any narrative about who or how Esteban died. Actually, there's several, but the 2 that are the most prevalent ones is one, they give him gifts and even give him women, and in trying to get away, they killed him with some arrows. Another story is that because he claimed to be a medicine, some Zunis say that they cut off his legs and said to him, well, if you're so strong with your medicine, heal yourself. So no one really knows the complete story, but we do know that at Hawiku or at Cibola, he was killed. Is that person's question. Wait, Matt.
Okay. Thank you, John. That's really great stuff. Well, Of course, Coronado did not find the gateway to Asia and had to decide at that point whether to continue on and turn back. And what he did was he sent an advance party to the east because they found out that to the west there were no more large settlements of any kind. He sends Hernando de Alvarado, one of his young captains, to the east, and Alvarado arrives at the Rio Grande Valley in September of 1540. So this is one of the reasons I kind of like that this talk is happening now. It's exactly 480 years since Alvarado became the first non-native person to describe the Rio Grande Valley. And he says, this Rio de Nuestra Senora, which is what they called it at that time, flows through a very wide level and fertile land planted with cornfields. There are some groves of cottonwoods, and there are 12 towns. And of course, this is what the Rio Grande looks like these days, with the groves of cottonwoods, and you can see lands planted with cornfields. The 12 towns are along the Rio Grande Valley from the town of Bernalillo, which is about here, down to Albuquerque. This is about a 15-mile stretch of the Rio Grande from northern Albuquerque to the town of Bernalillo. And you see that the settlements are on both sides of the river. This is 11 of the towns. I think the 12th town is probably to the south at Isleta Pueblo today. Sandia Pueblo is here. And so these 12 towns were in what they ended up calling the Tiwish province, which was probably the word that the Tiwa people, who still live here today, called themselves. It's a mishearing of the word, but that's how they pronounced it, Tiwish. And these 12 pueblos or villages or towns along the Rio Grande in this 15-mile stretch may have had a population of 10 to 20,000 people. The research I'm going to talk about today is at this site here at the south end on the west side of the Rio Grande called Piedras Marcadas, the village of the marked stones. Well, the Tiwish War, so we're in the Tiwish province, and it turns out that the earliest named series of conflicts in the history of this country is called the Tiwish War, and it took place from 1540 to 1542. The expedition, when it left, was not prepared for winter in any way. They came up from the tropics. The Indios Amigos had never experienced cold. Most of the Europeans hadn't either. They arrive in what is going to be one of the coldest winters on record at the end of 1540. They begin to freeze. They're starving. And when they show up in the Tiwish province, they take over a village to be able to stay there for the rest of the winter. They start taking over food and clothing from the Pueblo people. Then there's a possible rape or a rape that happened. And when the Pueblo man tried to get justice, he was denied. The Pueblos reacted by stealing horses and killing some of the native guards. The Spanish retaliate and attack a Pueblo. They start to burn it down. When the Pueblo men surrendered and thought they were prisoners of war, then one of Coronado's captains tried to burn them at the stake. Then the Spanish go up and down the river on both sides and raid all of the villages, rob them of timbers for fuel. And the Pueblos had seen enough. They fortified themselves at their last strong village, a village called Mojo. Coronado attacks that village unsuccessfully and lays siege to the village for 50 to 80 days. Other fighting happens. And by the time the entire Tiwish War, so-called, is done, the Pueblo resistance is broken, and at least 500 Pueblo people end up losing their lives in this Tiwish War. These villages are made of adobe. They're not masonry. This is actually Zuni Pueblo, but it's a good photograph of a village made of adobe. And because they're made of adobe, after they deteriorate, they go back into the ground. And so this is the village, the Pueblo site of piedras marcadas. This is what it looks like, the Sandia Mountains in the background, the groves of cottonwoods. And it is just rolling terrain with salt bushes. And all of the adobe walls have melted back into the ground. The city of Albuquerque acquired the site for protection in the late 1980s, and it got included into Petroglyph National Monument by 1990. But when we started talking to elders, what we found out was the elders advised us, you archaeologists have dug up all of our ancestral villages in the Rio Grande Valley. All of our Tiwa villages are gone. This is the last one. So we plead with you, do not dig up this site the way you have dug up all of our other sites. Out of respect, we know that our ancestors are here, and we plead with you to come up with other ways to do research. And so in particular, what was decided was if any research was going to happen, it was going to be with the use of remote sensing, geophysical instruments, non-invasive. The elders had advised no broad-scale excavations. A little bit of testing was okay, but no major excavations, and to leave the site as intact as possible. What we started to do was to collect information using a variety of instruments, and the most effective one was called electrical resistivity. So you go up and down these transect lines with an instrument that sends electrical current through the ground. It reads the strength and speed of the current, and by comparing all of these readings, you end up with what is effectively like an X-ray of the ground. So this is about a 2.5 acre area here, and when the electrical resistivity was done, you can see the outlines of many adobe rooms. Remember, these are not standing above the ground. These are buried now below surface, and you can see the outlines of adobe walls that make adobe rooms. These are in the shape of big quadrangles. This is one of those excavated sites that the elders referred to. It's up to the north, now called Coronado Historic Site, or Kuawa. But you can see the big range of adobe rooms running on both sides of a quadrangle with an open area in the middle called a plaza. And you can see the same arrangement here. This is from excavations. You can see the same arrangement with the electrical resistivity and the blocks of rooms running all around an open central area. Again, this is what it might have looked like with 2 or 3 stories of adobe. And here what I've done is I've taken the outlines of the adobe rooms from the electrical resistivity and made a drawing, a cartoon of this set of rooms, about 450 rooms in the central part of the site. And there's this open area here. I labeled the features, and you can see there's a possible passageway here, another passageway here. This open area here is a plaza, and you can see the large ceremonial room called a kiva. There's one here and another kiva over here. So you can tell what the architecture of the site was through the geophysics and remote sensing without having done any excavation. We also did a 3-dimensional reconstruction of the way we think the site is, because if you look closely, you can see that there are areas where the adobe is very thick and massive over here, up here in these areas, and we conjecture that those are places where there are 2- and 3-story high rooms. But it's basically a large rectangular room block with an open plaza. When we were clearing the site to do the electrical resistivity, we did notice a couple of bits of metal, and took one of those bits of metal to a historian who's an expert on the Coronado expedition, and he looked at it and he said, well, that is a nail, wrought iron nail from the Coronado expedition. I really have almost no doubt. So colleagues of mine from the National Park Service suggested that we would do systematic surveys with another remote sensing instrument, and that's called a metal detector. And what we did was we did systematic back and forth, very careful metal detection on the site. Metal detectors themselves have a kind of a bad reputation because of their use by looters in Civil War sites and others, but archaeologists have come to find that sites where there are metal artifacts, it's a very good remote sensing tool, especially if it's done very carefully and the mapping is done carefully. Well, after all of the years now of doing work on the site, you can see these again. This is the architecture. So we've got the architecture itself, but when you lay on the locations of all of the metal artifacts, you have two sets of information that come together to make one picture. So these dots, the red dots, are iron artifacts. They're wire fragments, nails, nail heads, nail shaft fragments. And the green dots are the non-ferrous, that is lead and copper alloy artifacts. We have found 1,600 16th century metal artifacts in this area, overlaid on top of the architecture. This rectangle here is the size of a football field. So you can see that within the size of a football field, you have well over 1,000 16th century metal artifacts. The area that's been investigated is about a football field and a half, about 2.2 acres or so. But you can tell by looking that there are some very important concentrations of artifacts, and I will get to that in a second. Now, what do these things look like? Some of them are not exactly what you'd call postcard quality. They're just fragments of wrought iron that are broken. But this is an example of one of the artifacts that kind of kicked the whole thing off. It's a wrought iron nail, and it's very diagnostic of the 16th century, of the 1500s. It has a very peaked head like this. These are handmade wrought iron nails, and we found about 100 of these now over the years. But this is quite diagnostic of the 16th century. We also found down to the smaller ones. This is just a 1/4 inch in diameter, but links of chainmail, which were also described as having been worn by some of the men who came on the expedition. But when you start to look at the totality of these artifacts, and many of them are personal items, you realize that some of these are possessions that were broken or lost that belonged to the Europeans on this expedition. These are copper alloy lace tags that were on the ends of either cloth or leather to lace up not shoes but shirts, other clothing fasteners, copper alloy nails, the tip of a scabbard, the tip of a strap, buckles, a shaver or a graving kind of tool, another medallion or strap, and a ornate belt loop. This is a very important artifact. It was it's the cinch of a horse bridle, so it's an artifact directly related to those horses. A piece of quilt, a broken dagger, and a great big long copper awl. So these are all European artifacts, and some of them are the only ones that we know of that have ever been found anywhere in this country. So not only are they quite indicative of the people's personal possessions, but they're also really quite rare, and they together end up telling a story that I'll go into a little bit. Now, you remember that I talked about crossbows and arquebuses or muskets, and if I haven't already said so, I think you can surmise that all of this loss of personal items, the breakage that's involved, the concentrations and distributions, these all are indicative. They indicate that there was a battle or a series of skirmishes that happened at this pueblo. And this is the proof of it. The Coronado expedition, the absolute diagnostic of the Coronado expedition are these crossbow bolt heads. The crossbows had short arrows called bolts. The tips are called bolt heads, and these bolt heads are made of solid copper, 98, 97% copper. When you find a copper crossbow bolt head, you know that you're dealing with the Coronado expedition. The other expeditions from the same period of time, like DeSoto in Florida, they used iron, but these copper ones are distinctive of the Coronado expedition. We've done lead isotope analysis on these, and the lead isotopes come back to mines from north central Mexico, so we know that they were made in Mexico to provision this expedition. We've in fact found 31 copper crossbow bolt heads in that 2-acre area. Some of them are intact, but you can see that many of them are stripped away at the base. They're sheared, they're bent, and they have been broken open from impact. So these crossbow bolt heads were not simply dropped. Many of them were shot and fired and hit something to break them open the way they have been broken. The muskets, the arquebuses were shooting lead balls, and these lead balls range in size from 25 caliber up to 40 caliber, up to 55 caliber. The bore of the arquebus or the musket was about just a little over a half an inch or 55 caliber. And so we have found, I think now the total is over 60 of these lead balls. And again, some of them were either dropped or shot, never hit anything, but some of them, when they did hit against a wall or something else, are completely flattened, like you see here. So we know that crossbows are being shot, the arquebus muskets are being shot, many items are being broken and lost. So this is indeed the site of a battle. Now the Indios Amigos are not using crossbows or arquebuses or swords or anything like that. They had their own native weapons, their own armas de la tierra. One of the most feared ones was a wooden war club with a groove on each side into which they would stuff obsidian blades. And on the surface of the site, there's indeed a lot of broken obsidian. We're trying to analyze that obsidian these days to see if it may have, in fact, been used in those wooden war clubs. But for certain, we know that there are Indian-style Mexican stone projectile points or arrow points. These are Pueblo in design. These are arrows that were shot by Pueblo people in defense of their own village. These are Mexican-style arrow points with the basal indentation and the side notching far up the sides of the arrow point. The basal indentation is a very, very good giveaway. These match with other ones that have been found in northern Mexico. So we have weaponry that was being used and deployed by the Indios Amigos, and not the least of which is one of the world's oldest weapons, the sling and the sling stones. And there are drawings from the codices from the time period that showed slingers. And these slingers have slings, and the slings have sling stones. The Aztecs in particular had a military caste system. The bottom of the caste system were the slingers who had to run forward, sling a hail of stones, run back, reload, and keep the whoever they were trying to fight at bay. Now, at Piedras Marcadas Pueblo, here is a perfect example of a slingstone. These slingstones are Indio Amigo Mexican implements. At the time of the first European contact, the use of the sling and slingstone was apparently unknown to the Pueblo people. But Coronado's chronicler said the enemy, meaning those Pueblo people trying to defend their own village, they had been getting ready for so many days and had many stones to hurl upon their men. So the Pueblos are throwing rocks off of the roofs trying to protect themselves against the people who are trying to assault their village. The Indios Amigos are slinging their own sling stones. And on the surface of the site, all around the edges and on top of where the roof tops would have been, we've now found 66 sling stones that were probably thrown and hurled by the Indios Amigos in the course of the fighting that happened at that site. This is almost a picture of what you might have imagined ended up happening there. Spanish soldiers on horseback with lances, their Indios Amigos with war clubs, the Pueblo defenders trying to defend their own site. And what are these things that are lying here in between on this codex? These are actually drawings of sling stones that were used and recorded in this codex page. The Spanish had a way of looking at their own tactics that they carried forward. They were left over from their warfare tactics in Europe. They would view the pueblos, the villages, the adobe buildings, the same way they viewed castles. That is, what you do is you try to assault the village. You try to climb onto the walls with ladders. You try to get onto the rooftops. And the whole objective is to get inside to the interior of the plaza, controlling the passageways. And once you get into the plaza, you would force your opponents into the corners of some of these enclosed spaces. If you couldn't do that, then you resorted to siege tactics like controlling the water supply and the food supply. And in fact, there are descriptions that the Pueblo people who had tried to resist 80 days began to run out of water. And finally, I think that the Spanish just tried shock and awe. That is the sound of an arquebus, the massiveness of the horses, the siege tactics of the Indios Amigos were all intended to intimidate their opponents into surrender. Now, if we look back at that distribution of those metal artifacts and the architecture and start to look at the concentrations, this south wall here of the village was surely the site of one or more organized attacks. You can see the number of you can see the number of artifacts that are broken and lost against the outside wall here. Probably more than one assault. In the northwest corner of the site, in the passageway, you see a huge amount of broken metal over the top of where that above ground kiva was. Maybe they had been trying to climb onto the roof to get into the plaza. And eventually, once the Spanish and Indios Amigos had gotten into the central part of the plaza, it looks like they must have fought their way diagonally from the northwest to the southeast, and maybe had forced their opponents into the southeast corner and had done a lot of violence against their opponents by shooting into that corner. I'm going to talk very briefly now about the effect of the expedition, what was saved and what was wrecked at that time. Certainly, there was the geographic information. Coronado and his expedition were the first to find the mouth of the Colorado. They were the first Europeans to describe the Grand Canyon, to have seen the pueblos that were at Zuni and Acoma, to have seen the pueblos that were along the Rio Grande from the south all the way up through Isleta, Sandia, Santo Domingo, all the way up to Taos, and finally over to Pecos. And when they went out onto the plains, they were the first people to have described these huge herds of buffalo or bison. But Coronado was not enlisted, and people did not invest huge amounts of money for geographic information. They were trying to find that route to Asia, and of course they never could have succeeded because that route is really not there. The expedition itself turned out to be an enormous economic and financial hardship on everyone who participated, but much more than that, it was a huge, massive impact on everybody who came in contact with it. So the impact of the expedition on all the indigenous people who lived in northern Mexico, north central Mexico, and then of the Pueblo peoples themselves was immense. You had very stable, very highly functioning social systems at that time. And here comes this huge expedition, and the Pueblo people knew ahead of time that it was coming. They were prepared, but it was just such an immense number of people to try to fight against that it was impossible. Coronado and one of his captains end up being indicted for abuses to the native people. Coronado had been charged with setting loose dogs, war dogs, onto some of the people, and the captain who started burning some of the prisoners of war at the stake were both brought up for charges. Coronado ended up being acquitted, but his captain Cardenas paying a fine and under house arrest for a couple of years. Now, the thing about it is that with all of those Indios Amigos and others and the expedition unraveling, as they returned back, many people peeled off, and especially the Indios Amigos must have looked at this situation. You know, it was a very incredible set of circumstances that you had the Spanish with interindigenous warfare happening. You had Indios Amigos, indigenous Mexican people, fighting against the Pueblo people. They probably had much more in common with each other than the Spanish ever would have had. And at some point, the Indios Amigos may have looked at this whole situation and said, well, I don't know what we're doing here. But they ended up, I think, in large numbers, not necessarily returning to their homeland. And what the result of this is the first actual mixing of the bloods. So in New Mexico, you have what is called mestizaje, the mestizo, mixed blood offspring of mixed marriages. And mestizaje begins with this Spanish incursion into the Southwest. Coronado is glorified in some ways. The 400th anniversary in 1940, they had big celebrations all through New Mexico, and you have this sort of triumphalism with the conquistadors. Well, in fact, there was no conquest because no lands were ever claimed for the Kingdom of Spain, and no settlements were ever done. But there are also many places that are named after Coronado. The biggest shopping mall in Albuquerque is called Coronado Mall. The I-40 coming through Albuquerque is called the Coronado Freeway. There's Coronado Elementary School and about a dozen other businesses and a city park. But whether or not that's all justified and everything, I think is a longer discussion we'll probably have towards the end of when I get to the last couple of these slides. But I do want to talk about probably the greatest effect, the Southern Tiwa themselves, with that population of 10 to 20,000 people in the Rio Grande Valley from 1540 through the 1500s in 11 or 12 towns. And by 1620, the population goes from 10 to 20,000 down to 800. And you go from 11 villages in this area down to 3, and they're all on the east side of the river. So all of these other villages are abandoned. This is not an effect of disease, because disease really didn't hit the native populations until the 1620s. It's an effect of people reorganizing and surviving by moving to take up residence with their other allies, and trying to escape the ravages that ended up accompanying this expedition. The elders, when they come out to the site, are very moved by what they see. They will talk in their own language about what it is they're seeing. You know that these stories are still alive among the societies, the cultures that are experiencing them now. And even though we have a tendency to look at history as being something that happened in the past, I think among the Pueblo communities, this is never a thing that is over. And these are events that that live on with the people in oral traditions and in the traditional names of places. There's a couple of books here that we recommend, but I want to give John a last word to try to sum up and respond to the things that I ended up with.
Let me simply add, Matt, and that's the unique thing about how we view history, how we view what occurred, especially as it applies to these communities, because the communities that we have here in New Mexico are fortunate enough that we live on our traditional land base. These are the lands that we have always lived on, our ancestors have lived on, and most importantly, our languages are still very prevalent in our communities. One thing I think we have to keep in mind is the mentality that allowed a foreign entity to come into our homelands and feel as it was their right to do it. And we use the words like discovery or colonization or conquistador. It would be much like if I simply walked into your house and said, "Oh, I discovered your wallet and your credit cards and your keys on the your dresser drawer," and decide, well, because I have more power, or I can choose and have the right to take whatever I have. That's the mentality into this area. Certainly, we are still here. We have adapted and we've modified to still be here, to want to help the rest of the world know that in spite of all, and we still have a narrative that we want to tell. And one of the questions that someone asked is the impact of the European encroachment into the Western Hemisphere. Certainly there are those that no longer have their voice to tell that story because they have all since been gone. But those of us that are still here, we take a great deal of responsibility, and that's my job. It's only because of my ancestors that I get to be here, and it's a great responsibility I have. I don't speak for them, I speak on behalf of them. And that's what we want to help our guests understand as it applies to our Pueblo peoples of the state of New Mexico. I did see someone's question a little earlier about Esteban. There were several stories that are to add about Marcus needs Coronado men, Matt was saying, they put all their money in this investment. This was an investment. They were entrepreneurs who came up with this era with every expectation that they would get richer than they had already been. And so with that and being confronted with these houses that didn't hold, or these communities that really, I should say, commodity rich, to be upset. And so with that, Coronado, in his anger and his, disappointment, had to restrain his men from killing the priest because they felt that he lied. And so Coronado actually had to, with the expectation that they would escort the priest back down, the orders that if anything happened to that priest, it was their head. That's how disappointed and how invested they were in trying to sort of understand the myths that were created as it applies to the Coronado. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I think that's a beautiful wrap up. And, it just helps to drive the point home. So many societies were lost in the colonization of the fourth part of the world. And the Pueblo resiliency has manifested itself into a story of survival that many societies have not been able to achieve. And I think it's just a testament to the wonderful nature, and it's a blessing that they were able to withstand the kind of full-on impact, not just of this expedition, but the following ones, and of the colonization, and all of the terrible events of the 1600s, and the continued consistent resistance that has really contributed to their long-term survival. We leave you with a couple of suggested readings: No Settlement, No Conquest, and Most Splendid Company, both by the Richard and Shirley Flint, who are the experts, historians on the Coronado expedition, wonderful writers and researchers, and a great book by Joe Sando on 8 centuries of Pueblo history, and then 2 semi-fictional works by Dennis Herrick, the winner of Metal People and Fated Pueblos of the Tiwish War. So with that, I think we will turn it back over to Mark to moderate whatever few minutes we may have left.
Right. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I really, really enjoyed it and really learned a lot. And we had many hundred participants. There are a number of questions. 2 of them are sort of related. One asks, can you say more about Coronado's decision to leave the Tiwa area? And another one related to that asks, just a second, let me scroll up. What do you think of the archaeological discoveries near Arkansas City, Kansas, near the banks of the river? And asks if they found Etzona or Quivira. So you didn't talk much about where the Coronado expedition went after it left the Rio Grande. Can you mention something about that?
No, I didn't. I didn't talk about that. One of the things that happens is that there are mythical places. One of them is called Quivira, but it was also a very clever stratagem on the parts of some of the native guides and other native people, because what they would say is, "We know what you're looking for. It isn't here. It's further to the east. There's a river where people float up and down on huge rafts with silver plates and things like that." So Quivira was a place that they tried to steer Coronado to and to get him away. And then I think that they were hoping that maybe he would end up falling on other people who would fight against him. Now, the findings near Arkansas, though I'm not quite, they must be related to the De Soto expedition. and people, archaeologists working in the southeast have been looking for DeSoto for quite some time. I want to draw a distinction between the DeSoto expedition and Coronado's in that there is no site east of the Mississippi that has 1/10 the amount of material that I've been talking about just at this one location. So DeSoto's route has proven to be extremely hard to try to nail down. Was there a question that was before that one? Whoops.
You're on mute, Mark.
Right. There are other questions, but one of those questions that I just mentioned also asked if there was any accounts of the return journey to Mexico.
Oh.
And what happened there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't. So once Coronado went out onto the plains, and they actually got out onto the Great Plains and realized that it was kind of a ruse, they got lost. I mean, they had to use ship navigation instruments just to be able to keep track of where they were. When they realized that they were going to have to go back to Mexico, they wound up back in the Rio Grande Valley and spent the next winter. So both winters were spent in the Rio Grande Valley. And the Pueblo people must have been horrified to see them coming back. But the return back was fairly swift, and they didn't describe it in great detail, except that the expedition continued to kind of dissipate as they went on. And one of the important things was that people stayed behind. Indios Amigos stayed behind, but expeditionary members stayed behind. A couple of them were found at Zuni Pueblo 40 years later, Europeans. And Coronado, on the way back, was in a horse race and fell off of the horse and almost killed himself. And he was in bad health the rest of his life and died at the ripe old age of 46 years old.
Wow. So interesting. John, your audio has been cutting out some, but I got this question that I thought would be good for you. Did the Coronado expedition, Tiwa War, or memories of them have any effects on the later Pueblo revolt?
Well, by the time Oñate came, which was another 40 years later, they tolerated another 60 years. Okay, and Matt brought up this interesting thing in his early presentation when he talked about when Cortez subdued the Aztecs. That's barely 30 years. Okay, this is at least a whole century before the Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. So all of these things are occurring a whole 100 years before the Eastern Seaboard is going to see the first Europeans coming to those indigenous peoples. So that's why it makes an impression as to the impact on the Pueblo peoples, and we are still here. Whereas most of those indigenous peoples on the Eastern Seaboard, unfortunately, we don't see any of our relatives anymore. So that's unique and very special that we still have our culture, our heritage, our spiritual constructs, and most importantly, our languages that we've tolerated and survived through that. But it's really Oñate who began to influence this area in 1598 that had the greater influence. They certainly knew who Coronado was, but it was Oñate and the impact he made over those 60 years from 1600 to 1680 that really has a greater impact.
Thank you, John. Your audio is great there. I got this question. Dr. Schmader, can you give references for the Indios Amigos, English language references for the specific indigenous people that you talked about that were part of the Coronado expedition?
Yes, those two books that I end up, the books by Richard Flint and Richard and Shirley Flint, they go into great detail about what they have been able to uncover. The thing that people have to understand is what is in the documents is very slanted in the sense that it just talks about most of the activities that the Europeans were involved in. So to find any mention of the Indios Amigos and absolutely no mention of women or anything like that, that's a limiting factor. But the Richard and Shirley Flint have documented the best they've been able to find in their 2 books.
Thank you. I got this question. What happened to the 19 tons of silver?
It wasn't actually physical silver. It was the cost of goods and the value of goods and services.
I see.
So when a captain, the average value contributed by a captain was $175,000 worth of silver, but it was counted in how many horses, how many other men he brought with him, what other weapons he brought, and things like that. So there never was a pile of silver. It was the value of goods and services.
Got it. I have an observation here from someone who says in Harrington, Kansas, there's a monument to Fray Juan Padilla, who traveled with Coronado, alleging that Fray Padilla was murdered there. Do you know anything of this?
I would have to look up to where it was that they conjectured that Fray Padilla was met his end, but I think the reports are that he decided to stay behind when Coronado left the plains, and he stayed, I think, with one other friar. But the exact place of death, I'm not sure if they've really figured that out. And the other friar ended up finding his way back to the Rio Grande Valley. So I'm going to profess a little bit of ignorance on if he actually was died at Harrington.
Thank you. As an aside for the people that ask questions about the going to the further to the east and into Kansas, I know that Scott Ortman at the University of Colorado has worked with a professor at Wichita State University at that site. I can't remember the name now. Etzona, is that it?
Yeah, Etzona.
Yeah, and I heard that professor say once that there was a Nahuatl speaker already living there when Coronado arrived. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but interesting observation. So we're about out of questions. I've got one. Can you give me any information on Santiago Pueblo?
No, it's not Santiago. It's Santo Domingo.
No.
Okay. Oh, in our language. Oh, Santiago. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. So Santiago Pueblo is one of the other major documented battle sites in the Rio Grande Valley. It shows on my map of the 11 towns of the Tihuix province. Scholars have been batting it back and forth over whether or not Santiago was the site of Coronado's main encampment when they came during the cold and took over a pueblo and took all the food and clothing. But similar work there has found a few hundred of related artifacts. It looks like there was some fighting going on there too. So in terms of the assemblages, the artifacts that are at Piedras Marcadas and Santiago Pueblo are both more battle related. And in fact, they should be a little bit more different. So we're still trying to figure out which is Coronado's main encampment and which one was the site of the siege. But Santiago, the problem with Santiago is that much of it was excavated in the 1930s by archaeologists, just like the elders had said they didn't want to see happen anymore. And then after that, almost all of it was wiped out by gravel mining. So the work that's been able to be salvaged there is commendable, but they are working within limitations. There wasn't that much of the site left. And even so, they've found several hundred pieces of metal.
Thank you. I got the question, did Coronado bring slaves back to New Spain?
What do you think, John?
Well, I'm sure that some of them were brought back because they started out as slaves. We know that Esteban was also a slave, and even though his owner died before he did, we know Mendoza enslaved him. So slavery was still very much a construct of the Spaniards, because many of the times not everybody wanted to do the work that they were entitled to. And this is the three policies that the Spanish crown incorporated. One of them was the incomida, which was basically forced servitude for the building of the churches and building of communities, that they were basically, it was an enforced feudal system that the Spanish then incorporated over those 60 years after 1690.
I got a follow-up question. Was Santiago also referred to as Gufor Pueblo? It means parched corn.
Right. They sometimes call it Alcanfor, which means camphor, but either Gufer, parched corn, or Alcanfor was Coronado's main base camp in the winter of 1540. And this is the debate that's going on between archaeologists and historians, and in fact has been going on for a really long time. I think that Santiago is Coronado's base camp, and so the answer is yes. Gufor, Alcanfor, Santiago are all synonymous, and in my view is where the base camp was for Coronado's initial camp.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep answering questions. We've gone over our time, but people can drop out if they want. We still have well over 100 participants. What did Isabella and Ferdinand think of Coronado's quote unquote success?
Oh, well, Ferdinand and Isabella had nothing to do with Coronado, right. Because Ferdinand died in 1519. When Ferdinand died in 1519, that's what led to Carlos I becoming the King of Spain, and then he lobbied to become the Holy Roman Emperor. So Ferdinand and Isabella had direct knowledge of Columbus brought back slaves from the Caribbean and went into the Spanish court and showed them off, along with other things that he had found. So Ferdinand and Isabella had only 2 degrees of separation from the Coronado expedition, nothing direct.
So can I add to that? One of the things that occurred just about the time that Coronado was here, and this relates to the slide that you showed, Matt, of the Spaniards having attacked dogs and then impaling and or burning them at the stake, was a report that was written by a Franciscan priest, Bartholomew de las Casas. It was called A Brief Report on the Destruction of the Andes, and that even though this priest was very adamant about this treatment of the indigenous peoples by the Spanish representatives, no one really adhered to it. No one was here locally to police them, to say to them, well, this is not how you should be treating them. You should be treating them with kindness and Christian love and drawing them into the Christian fold, which is really Isabella's primary emphasis as queen. She was very devout Christian, and she felt that as monarchs they should be spreading the Christian faith. But obviously we know that that didn't happen, and so we know that Bartholomew de las Casas' report was written, but it was not adhered to even up until the 1800s, where there was still slavery, forced servitude, the incomida that was part of the Spanish treatment of the indigenous peoples.
Okay, I'm going to just do a couple more and then we'll let you guys off the hook. I got the question of, did the Spanish Inquisition have an effect on increasing exploration?
The Inquisition had an effect because it helped to drive the out migration of people from old Spain, and they had to find somewhere to go. So many of them ended up coming to New Spain, that is Mexico. That's an indirect effect. I don't think the Inquisition itself had any major effect on the Coronado expedition, other than the fact that the tactics and mindset of many of the people who participated comes out of that milieu that sort of says that there is a superiority in societies that is followed, and certainly they viewed indigenous people as being inferior. So I think that mindset came out of the Inquisition.
Thank you. We got this question that we're going to do for later, but it's what about the Dominguez and Escalante expedition, which is over 200 years later than what we're talking about. But Taylor, there's a good topic for another webinar. We should look into that. So it's amazing to me, this history. It's so interesting. And just as one example, the incredible story of Esteban, which you went into tonight. And it strikes me that it's one of the, it's right up there with one of the most interesting stories in history. And yet my guess is it would be under 1% of Americans would know anything about Esteban. I was lucky enough to live at Zuni, one of John's home pueblos, for a few years working for the nation. And I think almost every child in Zuni knows the story of Esteban. And John, it's that history is kept alive, isn't it? Isn't there a Esteban Kachina?
Well, there are several. Actually, Hopi also has one too. Again, as Matt said, he was probably mostly a Northern African person who was probably a darker skin than the Spaniards. So, like he said, the first Europeans that the Pueblo people encountered was a black man, because that's probably what it was. We don't really have, there's no description of who he was. Even the Spaniards and his owner didn't really describe him. We actually have several names. One of his names is a Arab name, Mustafa. That's one of the names that he had. Esteban or Estebanico, and several others are attributed to him, but we really don't have a description of who this person was. But from the reports from the Spaniards and the other indigenous peoples along the Texas coast, and then also from Zuni, we know he was a real human being. He really existed.
Yeah, and what's your take on the fact that he committed transgressions at Zuni that cost him his life, and yet Zuni's, I don't know if honor is the right word, but remember him by keeping his memory alive with a kachina that dances in ceremonies?
Well, it's really a part of the narrative. As scientists, you all understand that with having data and information to explain and to interpret what you get out of the ground is important too, but it doesn't invalidate the oral narratives that exist amongst indigenous peoples. They have a certain value. They have a certain acceptance as part of who we are as human beings. That explains who we are. And so that's why we keep these stories alive, because they are pertinent to our being, our existence. And so I don't know if you're right. I don't know if it's the word of honor, but rather the fact that we recognize the fact that he was a real human being.
Yeah, well, it did a better job of teaching the history of Esteban than we've done in our schools. So, well, I want to thank you both for an amazing presentation and invite both of you to come to Crow Canyon as soon as that's possible again. And I look forward to continuing to learn from both of you. You had dozens of people write in thanking you for the nice presentation, including someone who tuned in from Australia. So it was very good.
Well, we want to thank you. I really do appreciate it. And I'm honored, Matt, that you asked me to help you describe really what it is by including this narrative. And I bring it back to a contemporary part. When we think about some people in this country saying that we should be telling history from a more patriotic point of view because it wants to be a positive perspective, that's really not what history is. There's some good parts and there's some bad parts, but we should be truthful to the narrative that exists, and that's being inclusive. That's what history is.
Absolutely, and I was so honored and thrilled to be able to do this alongside you, John.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, all of you, especially the 120 that have stuck with us until now. We'll call it an evening and look forward to the next webinar next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you again, Matt. Thank you, Taylor, and thank you, Mark.